Hello and welcome to Catching Up with Silvia Moreno-Garcia for Chimera Festival 2023. I'm Katalina Watt. I'm an author of speculative fiction and Gothic horror and literature officer at Creative Scotland, and I am absolutely delighted to be speaking with Silvia Moreno-Garcia. For those of you who don't know Silvia, I'll just give a brief introduction. Mexican by birth, Canadian by inclination, Silvia Moreno-Garcia is the author of a number of critically acclaimed novels, including Gods of Jade and Shadow, which won the Sunburst Award for Excellence in Canadian Literature of the Fantastic and Ignite Award, Mexican Gothic, Locus Award, British Fantasy Award, Pacific Northwest Book Award, Aurora Award, and Goodreads Award, and Velvet Was the Night, finalist with the Los Angeles Times Book Prize and the Macavity Award. She writes in a variety of genres, including fantasy, horror, noir, and historical. She's edited several anthologies, including She Walks in Shadows, World Fantasy Award winner, published in the USA as Cthulhu's Daughters. Silvia is the publisher of Innsmouth Free Press. Her fiction has appeared in numerous magazines and anthologies. She has an MA in Science and Technology Studies from the University of British Columbia, and she lives in Vancouver. So first of all, I wanted to start by saying welcome, Silvia, and it's an absolute joy to be speaking with you because you were one of kind of the first authors that made me think about writing as a viable career. And you probably don't remember, but I became a fan of your work because I saw you speaking at the Growing Room Festival in Vancouver in 2018. And it was really galvanizing for me because it was kind of, you're one of the first women of color I saw writing in the speculative fiction space. And you were also so transparent about the industry and really generous with your time and advice. And it just was a bit of an awakening moment for me. So it's a bit of a weirdly full circle moment to be talking to you today. So yeah, I wanted to start by asking you about kind of your journey into publishing. It's been quite a long journey with lots of twists and turns. So I wanted to kind of just hand it over to you to talk about how did you get into this weird and wonderful world of writing?
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I started writing short fiction in 2006, and I kept writing short fiction for many, many years. I've written, I think by now, something like 80 short stories that have been published in a variety of magazines. Most of my stuff was published in fanzines or semi-prozines, so very small magazines, the kinds of places where you get $10 for a story, that sort of thing. But I was able to learn a lot through that time, and eventually I published a novel in 2015 called Signal to Noise. And before that, I did do a short story collection with a Canadian publisher, but my first long form work was Signal to Noise, and it was actually published with a UK publisher. Came out in the UK. And then after that, I did a couple of books and more books. I moved around a lot. I changed a lot of publishers. I think I've had 5 or so publishers so far in my career. And right now I'm with Del Rey. Books is my kind of steady publisher. They are the ones who publish Mexican Gothic, which was my biggest hit. They're the ones who are publishing my upcoming books, including Silver Nitrate, which is coming out this July. And so there's been a lot of bouncing around in between writing short stories and all that kind of stuff. I kind of started my own micro press, which is how I won the World Fantasy together with Paulo Stiles for an anthology back in the day that we put together. So I've done a lot of things on the side. I worked a day job during all those years. So I just quit my day job last year. So that was the first time. This is my first year as a full-time. I've been for a year. I've been now a full-time freelance.
Amazing.
So
Congratulations.
Freelance writer. But I always worked a day job, a 9 to 5 job.
Yeah.
So in communications, that's what I did for a living. And that's kind of it for me. So
yeah,
it's an interesting thing. Writing and publishing is also a really interesting ecosystem. So I've been kind of around for a while, and the test of any writer is longevity. I'm doing pretty well so far, and we'll see how I do in the next few years or so.
Amazing. Thank you for that kind of whistle-stop tour into the many, many things that you have done and continue to do. I kind of wanted to pick up on a couple of the things that you pointed out there. So you juggle so many things, you wear so many hats, and you mentioned that you know, you had a day job as many writers do as well. Until very recently, you've been able to kind of go full time, which is great. So I kind of wanted to ask you, like, what does your writing routine look like for you when you kind of, you're writing, you're advocating, you're editing? How do you juggle all those things? How do you make that work?
I work every day. I don't necessarily write every day, but I do work
Hmm.
every day, whether that's research or if I have a meeting or an event like this, I'm doing work constantly or reading, blurbing, that kind
Mm,
of stuff. So I just do work every day, and then I try to get a certain word count in a week so that I'm not doing just one word a week, because then you couldn't write anything at all.
mm,
And I'm the breadwinner, so if I don't make enough money, nobody in my family eats, and I do have
mhm,
3 kids, a mother and a husband, so they all have to eat. So that's just, when you're freelancing, you just have to be very mindful of your time, like in
yeah.
any kind of freelancing profession, whether you're a freelancing artist and you're painting covers or any other kind of freelancing, you just have to be very mindful of how much time you're spending in every kind of task and making it work for you. So that's what I do. I balance all the kind of things that people don't think so much about a writer
Yeah.
so often, which is like going over contracts or having meetings with your editor, that kind of stuff,
Hmm.
with the things that people imagine a writer does, which is sit in front of I guess, of a typewriter, even though most people don't have typewriters these days, but it's that old-fashioned image of somebody sitting
Yeah.
alone at a typewriter. And I don't have a desk. I'm sitting here at my dining room table. So,
So am I.
yeah, that's kind of like the reality of most working writers.
Yeah.
And it's always been like that.
Hmm.
You look at sometimes people say, well, in the good old days, everybody made a lot more money. But H.P. Lovecraft, who I did my thesis on, and has been a very influential writer,
Yeah.
he used to eat cans of expired beans. And most of the income he made was actually from doing revision work, which is like
Mm.
editing, right?
Hmm.
And so there was always that difference between the slicks and the pulps, and everybody who wrote for the pulps made a lot
Hmm.
less money than the people who managed to sell a story or two to the
Mm.
slicks. So you do have historically kind of like this differentiation between
Yeah.
kind of income levels of writers. And so you just have to, normally you have to diversify, especially these
Hmm.
days,
Hmm.
in order to make some kind of steady income. And that's what most of the working writers that I know do,
Yeah.
realistically. Yeah.
Hmm. That's so interesting that you mentioned this idea of I call it like writer admin. And my fiance isn't doesn't have a creative practice at all. He's in STEM, he's an engineer, and he sort of says, "Oh, you seem to spend a lot of time like, you know, chairing events, which I really enjoy, or like delivering workshops, or like just answering emails and looking at contracts, all of that stuff." He's like, "You don't seem to have as much time for writing." And I have kind of a full-time day job as well. And I'm like, yes, it's funny how all of that stuff sometimes gets in the way of actually sitting down and creating new work.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And you just have to consciously make that time.
Absolutely.
And I think it was Neil Gaiman who said that he sits down for an hour
Mm,
in front of the computer, and he just puts away the other distractions like the cell phone or
mm,
whatever. So
mhm.
after a while you get bored and you end up just writing something, right? A sentence or two. Because if you
Yeah.
are locked in a room or at the table, right, like right now with a
Yeah.
computer, and you can't use like the internet or the apps or
Yeah.
watch TV on it, you eventually do start thinking of stuff like
Mm,
that. So
mhm.
there's a lot of distractions that just consume a lot of our time. And I
Yeah.
have an app that tracks my time on my cell phone. And yeah, I spend a lot
Oh,
of time
cool.
doing stupid things. So you have to consciously kind of
Yeah.
stop doing that and focus on some of the other stuff. Yeah.
Definitely. I wanted to kind of chat a bit about this idea of you were talking about like diversifying your income streams as an author, and you touched a bit upon kind of longevity and resilience. And you know, it's amazing that there's kind of being all these reissues of your backlist, and you're reaching kind of new readers who maybe weren't familiar with some of your older work. And I wanted to ask you a bit about, I suppose, Mexican Gothic was a real turning point in terms of like your commercial success, and you'd had kind of critical and commercial success before, but this was, you know, in the way they say sort of actors have like a breakout role, that almost felt like a breakout novel kind of from a reader's perspective. Did it feel that way to you? And I suppose, how do you feel that your author career has changed since then.
Yeah, it was my sixth novel, I think. So some people thought it was my first novel.
Yeah.
And there was not, I was been along for quite a while. Yeah, I mean, it's made some things easier, and other things continue to be the same, because in publishing, what happens is that you're only as good as your last book. And it's not well, like any freelancing profession, it's not a steady kind of career where you have tier progression, where you can say, well, I'm being promoted now. It all depends on the sales and changes in the market that you can't influence. But it has made it easier to, for example, renegotiate, get a new contract, or get a bigger advance.
Yeah.
Get attention in certain places that I would have never gotten attention at, and get more invitations to things that I would have never got invitations to. But the rest of it continues to be the usual kind of work that you can't assume, I think, in writing, that anything that happened in the past will be repeated in the future. So I think you can kind of project incomes, for example, based on what has happened in the past, more or less, and make a projection for this year. But like, I have a friend who's also a full-time writer, and he said his income for this year came out, when he did last year, when he did the projections, this year was looking better, and right now it's not. It's not looking like that. The sales have dropped really for some of his titles. And so that's just, kind of a reality that sometimes you have to look at. So you always have a savings account with a certain amount of, like, 6 months of income that you put together for the lean days in this kind of situation. So that can't be helped. You can't predict everything or control everything, but it does give you more leeway in certain situations. And there's definitely some opportunities that I would never have had if I hadn't had the success of Mexican Gothic. But I mean, at the end of the day, it's you go on a book by book basis as a writer, because nobody remembers what happened. And in bookstores, there's such a quick churn in terms of titles that get put in.
They're always looking forward.
Yeah, a book has like a 6-month lifespan, really. That's the reality of a book, which is kind of weird and sad. But after 6 months, you don't see most new titles in a bookstore. They come and go, and you make way for the new stuff. There's some perennials, but those are the big people. So you're looking at a lifespan of 6 months, really, for a hardcover. And then maybe if you get lucky, you get, like a little lift in the paperback. So it's just being aware
or a reissue
of that. Or a reissue, like I've had a bunch of reissues lately. So that's one thing that wouldn't have happened before. Like, the reissues are an opportunity that I wouldn't have had easily before. I mean, I might have had a reissue like 10 or 20 years down the future, perhaps. But having them all kind of happen in the span of a couple of years was because of the success of Mexican Gothic, obviously. So,
that's really great. We've talked a fair bit about the business of publishing, so I want to turn now to kind of the craft, and asking you a bit about, you've written sort of so many books across different genres, different kind of time periods for your historical works, and I kind of wanted to ask you about, like, what is the most fun for you in terms of, doing that genre hopping, kind of doing that reinventing and subverting of genre tropes? What do you find fun, and what excites you about it?
I mean, I get tired about doing the same thing, so I'm always kind of thinking about what's coming next, what's going to happen in the next thing, and trying to do something that I haven't done before, because I get really bored of a book at a certain point in time. And so that's why I don't do series, because I can't see myself wanting to stay in a specific universe. So part of the fun of that is just the discovery aspect of it, that I'm able to go into a different place and time and see what happened there that maybe I don't know so well. So there's always bits and bobs that I'm learning. So I really like the research and the change in pace. But some people really love, like, 10-book series and things like that, and I'm not that kind of person. And they have their drawbacks too. I mean, commercially, for a really long time, we were pushed to doing series, and it was very hard to get a deal as a standalone. But I tend to think that I'm more nimble if I'm a standalone. But that's just me.
No, that makes sense. And I guess, are there any, like, genres or time periods, or like genre conventions that kind of down the line you would want to sort of play in that sandbox?
I've talked about a Western for a while now, and I don't have my
Ooh,
Western quite yet, but
okay.
maybe one day it'll come to me. But I do want to write a
Yeah.
Western, partially because they're very out of fashion, and
Okay.
think during my lifetime I've seen the
Mm,
Western section at bookstores go from being an
mm,
actual section to disappearing. To the last time I went
yeah.
to a bookstore, it was just a shelf, and it was just one
Mm,
writer,
right.
Louise L'Amour. So
Okay.
so that's been interesting to see how something just vanishes. And I think I want to work in
Yeah.
that space for that reason.
That's so interesting that you're drawn to kind of the area that is like considered like not particularly commercial, but I suppose there's something quite liberating about that.
Yeah, well, nobody really, I think, thought that Gothic fiction would be very commercial in our day and age. So it's I'm always kind of going
Mm,
places that are not necessarily the most popular at the moment, but it's very hard to predict trends as a writer. I think if you're
yeah.
chasing trends, you're doing it wrong.
Absolutely. And you're a bit of a trendsetter as well, I would say. I feel like after kind of Mexican Gothic came out, I think, it's not necessarily that there's kind of copycat publishing, which is a thing that happens, but more there's something like in the zeitgeist because there were so many amazing Gothic novels that came out, especially by authors of color and women of color, particularly. And a lot of kind of engaging with those post-colonial themes. And I really enjoy that you're not afraid to kind of just say the quiet part out loud about within your work but also within kind of your speaking about the industry. And I guess I wanted to ask how has that been for you, because I know that like if you're kind of a creator from a marginalized background, it often does fall on your shoulders to advocate for changing an entire system, and that can be quite exhausting. But have there been any like networks or individual people who have been really like helpful to you or supportive of you in terms of bettering the publishing industry for everyone? Because yeah, I've seen your Twitter threads and they are particularly insightful and also kind of a bit of a rallying call.
Well, there's always people who are kind of helpful and kind to you in
Mm-hmm.
different aspects. I'm My agent is very helpful with some discussions, and my editor, I think, understands some of the things that
Yeah.
we're coming from when we come from, and the entire editorial team, I think, supports some of the things that I have talked about. They don't always know exactly. There's a lot of
Yeah.
blind spots, and so that's one part of the thing that goes on is having to do some explaining of some of the blind spots that they don't
Mm.
necessarily haven't considered before,
Yeah.
and suddenly I'm telling them, well, that's going to be a problem,
Mm-hmm.
and then
Mm-hmm.
they say, oh, okay, well, we never thought of that because I've never had an author like me before in that
Yeah.
sense. So there's a lot about being the first and what that means
Mm.
in a
Mm-hmm.
writing ecosystem. But yeah, my agent is very helpful, and he does a lot of the um, helping with some of those, and my editor and all that kind of stuff in the regular
Mm-hmm.
world. And that's the way it should be, because your agent is
Yeah.
there. I mean, they take the commission for that reason. It's so you
Yeah.
don't have to have certain discussions, or they're there with you for certain discussions as kind of backup. But there are a lot of conversations that um, have had to be had about my particular books, and also some conversations about the industry in general that do not concern me specifically, but that just concern um, writers of color in general, and gaps
Yeah.
or issues that may not, that sometimes people do not consider to be
Mm-hmm.
important. But there's a lot of people who do a lot more important jobs and work in that arena that I do. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I've just been kind of talking about that for a while, but I'm not on
Yeah.
Twitter anymore, so I've
Yeah.
kind of retired from that for now.
That's fair. That's that sounds good. Um, yeah, I want to ask you, I guess, kind of like if you've had like if there's been a particularly kind of lovely like reader interaction that you've had over your career. I'm sure there's been lots of really memorable ones, but ones that were just kind of like nicely surprising, like whether it's a piece of fan art or like a cosplay or anything like that, that's been just kind of like, wow, I wrote a book and people really love it and are super kind of dedicated to it.
Most people are really nice, but I don't get to meet that many people in
Mm,
person. I've traditionally done, I've started doing more events now, but
mhm.
I traditionally couldn't because I had to use my vacation time for
Of course, yeah.
vacation and not for traveling. So it was only
Yeah.
last year that I got to travel a little bit more and
Mm.
meet more people. There was this young woman who made a scarf for me that I actually wore
Oh,
in
wow.
the winter, and it was really, really long. And I like that. But there's other people who have given me drawings or just said that it was very nice meeting me. And I've
Yeah.
seen some digital art online that sometimes people have tagged me or a friend seen it and said, look at
Yeah.
that. So that's always kind of cute. So yeah, most people are really, really very nice and very pleasant.
That's really lovely. And I feel like your books are so cinematic and like just the description. And I was kind of wondering, like, if there's a specific like adaptation, it doesn't have to be film, it could be like a video game or like a board game or whatever. Yeah, if there's like one of your books and a particular kind of different creative medium that you could see it working with and you think could be kind of fun to adapt it to.
Um, yeah, I mean, it would be nice to see it adapted to another medium just to see what somebody else
Yeah.
does with it. I mean, I think something like Gods of Jade and Shadow would make a good kind of graphic novel
Mm.
adaptation. A little
Mm.
cheaper to do it like that than to do it in a movie. So yeah, so something like that would be
Yeah.
sort of fun. But
Cool.
but otherwise, yeah, I'm not quite sure. I mean, live action theater or anything like that. I don't know if anybody.
Mm.
I mean, I suppose something like Velvet Was a Night, which is a noir, can be adapted to stage.
Mm.
There's not, or maybe Untamed Shore, which is another noir. I'm just thinking how
Mm.
many characters you have on stage kind of
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
situation.
yeah.
Um, yeah, but I definitely see something. Some of my books I think can make good graphic novels.
Mm.
Mhm.
That's something to think about. And I have just a couple more questions for you. So I suppose, you kind of you've got several books under your belt. You're kind of at a point in your career, and looking forward to kind of the future. It feels like you're a bit of a powerhouse when it comes to so many like different types of projects, and no one can necessarily predict what you're going to do next, which I think makes you such an exciting author to read. So in terms of like, I guess, do you have like a piece of advice that you would want to give to emerging writers today? Like, for example, kind of looking at you, I'm just like, oh, it's really cool to see that you don't have to be restricted, as you say, by like genre or series. You can kind of do what takes your interest, which feels quite liberating. So yeah, any kind of like golden nuggets of advice that you'd have?
I mean, yeah, you just have to chip at it.
Yeah,
It's like anything, like drawing, for example. You don't draw a Rembrandt the first time you walk
yeah.
into an art class, and it's the same thing with writing. You probably don't come up with a novel the first time you sit down at a computer, and you probably don't get a deal with the first novel that you write. I mean,
Yeah.
my first novel was not. Uh,
Mm,
I had several novels before what people can see as my first novel that
mm-hmm.
was publishable. So it's just it's a long term
Mm-hmm.
thing, and you really have to kind of figure out what's your motivation for doing it and why,
Yeah.
and keep that motivation, because oftentimes there's not going to be um, if basically if you're looking for external validation, it's going to be very difficult
Mm,
sometimes, because you can put out a book and you can sell 500 copies and you don't get many reviews. And if you're basing your own self-worth on external validation like that, for example, the number of
yeah.
books you sold, and then you say, well, I'm a shitty human being, it's going to do a lot of kind of psychological damage to
Yeah.
you. So you
Yeah.
need to find something else in the work that makes you happy, that keeps you
Mm,
going, and things that you want to achieve in the future that are not dependent basically on others, like, oh well, I'm going to sell 500 copies next year,
yeah.
or 5,000 or 500,000. So there has to be something else that you're trying to achieve within the
Mm,
work. And it can be things, in my case, like trying a new genre, like trying to write a Western, trying to
yeah.
find something that works in the form of a Western, or trying to contribute a certain um, number of stories to anthology. So it doesn't mean I'm going to sell them. It just means, during the year, I
Yeah.
tell myself I'm going to write 3 stories and I'm going to try to
Mm,
place them with anthologies. And we'll see
yeah.
how that goes. So that kind of stuff is not dependent on any external party giving you
Yeah.
that validation. It's just you kind of exploring and working on your art. And it's the same with a painter or something like that. When you try a new painting technique, a new material, or
Hmm.
you start exploring a new kind of thing that you want to represent. And it's the same
Yeah.
with writing. But if then you expect, well, I'm going to sell, 5 of these paintings for sure, and I'm going to sell them each for
Right. Yeah.
$50,000, that becomes a more difficult proposition. Or everybody's going to
Yeah.
love it, for example. Nobody's going to hate it. Everybody's going to love it. That's a really difficult proposition
Yeah.
because somebody's always going to hate it.
Yeah.
And sometimes, like with Mexican Gothic, it's a pretty polarizing book. The people who love it adore it, but the people who hate it hate it. So if I was basing my self-worth on kind of like the reception of it
Right.
on a platform like Goodreads or online, I would feel
Yeah.
really bad all the time, because half of the time I would feel like crap. And the other time, half of the day, I would feel really good.
Yeah.
And so that's not the way it works. Like I said, I know it's a polarizing work. It's not for everybody. And the people who love it are probably going to be telling people about it years from now.
Yeah.
And
Exactly.
so that's the nice part. But if I was
Yeah.
basing my self-worth on that, then I would be very depressed.
Yeah. No, I think that sounds very wise. Kind of have like clear, attainable goals that you can control, and
Yeah.
find something joyous in the work that is kind of not dependent on the industry, because as we know, the industry is kind of very unpredictable, but what you can control is your writing and what you want to work on next. So that sounds incredibly wise. And my last question for you, Silvia, is what excites you about kind of the speculative fiction community at the moment, and like what hopes do you have for its future?
I mean, it's changed a lot since I started out in this business, just in terms of writers of color. When I started out in 2006 writing short stories, I remember the only other person I saw who was a person of color was Aliette de Bodard. She was in France, and she was kind of like, it was like there's these two people. And then I kind of started meeting people online, and more it has become kind of more common. So now, before I used to know everybody, kind of like who was a person of, and I'm not joking. I knew everybody who was
Yeah.
a speculative writer of color. There was nobody that I did not know online,
Yeah.
at least, not in person maybe, but online.
Sure.
And I could, like email them basically. And nowadays there's so many, surprising every year, because I sometimes go into a bookstore and there's people I hadn't heard about. So that's good,
Yeah.
because it means that the universe has expanded, and it's not just the 10 people that I met like 15 or almost 20 years ago that are writing. And it's exciting to see also how some genres are coming back. Horror, which was for a very long time not a thing for many years after the collapse in the 1990s. So kind of the horror genre, where it went really, and now it's coming kind of back. You're seeing more horror acquisitions and more horror books, and not just in adult spaces but also in young adult. And so that's really kind of fun when you see like the kind of the sad marginalized genre coming back into bloom. So those are two good things that I think are pretty fun. And and I just look forward to seeing what happens in the next few years in speculative fiction.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for kind of all your generosity kind of with your time, and talking through giving us a kind of insight into your writing journey and your career. It's been an absolute privilege for me to speak with you. So thanks very much, Silvia, and thank you to Chimera, and thanks to everyone at home who is watching this in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.